Let's imagine these two ships not as wooden sails, but as two entirely different warriors. One is an imperial soldier, born for linear formations and total control of the sea. This is the Roman trireme, a legion on water. The other is an elusive raider, a wolf pack designed for strikes from the shadows. This is the Viking longship. Almost 1,000 years separate them. The golden age of the trireme was the Punic Wars of the 3rd century BCE, while the Viking age spanned the 9th to 11th centuries CE. They hail from completely different worlds. One ship brought Rome victory at the Battle of Actium. The other carried out the famous raid on Lindisfarne. They never met in battle, so comparing them in a direct confrontation is meaningless. It's like asking who is stronger, a tank or a helicopter. The answer depends on the battlefield. Our question is deeper. Which of these ships was a more perfect tool for its specific tasks? Whose engineering thought more precisely responded to the challenges of its era? We are not looking for a winner in a hypothetical battle, but an absolute champion in its weight class. For the trireme, this was domination of the open sea and destruction of the enemy fleet. For the longship, it was coastal raiding and troop deployment deep inland. To understand the ships, one must understand their worlds. For Rome, the Mediterranean was our sea, a vast but predictable transport artery. For the Vikings, the North Atlantic was a hostile, unpredictable element, a path to glory and wealth. One world demanded order, the other survival and adaptation. This world of order confronted Carthage. Rome was a land power, its strength rooted in its legions. But the sea dictated its own rules, and to win the Punic Wars, the Romans had to become sailors, and quickly. The historian Polybius recounts an almost incredible story. The Romans captured a beached Carthaginian ship and used it as a model. They launched mass production, building a fleet of 100 ships in just 60 days. Rome didn't invent the trireme, but it perfected it to engineering excellence, transforming it into a weapon of total dominance. Its purpose was simple and brutal: to find the enemy fleet and destroy it in a decisive battle. Its design perfectly suited this task. The heavy, wide hull provided the stability necessary for combat. 3 banks of oars delivered a powerful, though brief, burst for ramming. But the trireme's main weapon was its deck. It was wide and strong, designed to carry an entire manipulus of marines. Up to 120 legionaries could board, in addition to 170 rowers. This transformed the ship from a mere vessel into a floating platform for boarding. Its primary tactic was to close with the enemy and turn a naval engagement into a land battle, where Roman swords had no equal. For this, the Romans devised an ingenious innovation: the corvus, or raven. This was a boarding bridge with a massive iron hook at its end. Upon impact, it crashed onto the enemy vessel's deck, locking the ships together. After this, legionaries, masters of close combat, would storm the enemy ship and decide the battle's outcome. This technological device nullified the advantage of more maneuverable Carthaginian ships and brought Rome victory at the Battle of Mylae in 260 BCE. However, it came at a cost. The heavy corvus made the ship unstable. Romans lost entire fleets in storms because of it, and eventually abandoned this dangerous device. The heart of the trireme was its rowers. Contrary to Hollywood myths, Roman warships were rowed not by slaves but by free citizens and allies. It was a demanding but prestigious service. Approximately 170 men working in unison created incredible thrust. Their coordination was akin to a complex mechanism, with a musician setting the rhythm on a flute. a true orchestra of muscular power. But this orchestra quickly exhausted itself. The trireme was a sprinter, not a marathoner. Its combat radius was limited, and for long voyages, it relied on a simple sail. This perfection also had its limits. Its deep draft prevented the trireme from entering rivers or operating in shallow waters. The heavy hull made it vulnerable in strong storms. It was entirely dependent on coastal supply bases. Every evening, these enormous ships had to be pulled ashore. This was not only for the crew's rest, but also to allow the pine and fir hull to dry out, as it quickly absorbed water, becoming heavier and slower. The trireme was an ideal tool for controlling a closed sea, but utterly useless for exploring unknown lands or for swift raids deep into enemy territory. The Viking world, however, was built precisely on this. Here, there were no imperial fleets to be destroyed in decisive battles. Instead, there were rich but weakly defended monasteries, towns, and villages along the coasts and rivers of Europe. The main task was not to defeat the enemy in open combat, but to strike suddenly and vanish with the plunder before reinforcements could arrive. The word Viking itself likely derives from an Old Norse verb meaning to go on an expedition overseas. Thus, the longship didn't just transport warriors, it created them. It was the key that opened their path to Paris and the coast of England. It was born from an absolute need for speed, stealth, and versatility. Its construction was ingenious in its simplicity. A long, narrow, and flexible hull built using the clinker method, where planks overlap like scales. This made the ship not only light, but also allowed it to flex with the waves rather than fight against them. But its main asset was its shallow draft. The Gokstad ship, found in Norway, with a length of 23 meters, had a draft of less than 1 meter. The secret to its flexibility was that the planks were fastened to the frames, not with iron nails, but with flexible spruce roots. This allowed the hull to breathe with the waves, like a living creature, and opened its path into the heart of Europe. The longship was a perfect hybrid. A huge rectangular sail made of grease-soaked wool caught the wind and allowed for swift crossings of the open sea. Incidentally, such a sail sometimes cost more than the ship itself. But in calm conditions, in narrow rivers, or during battle, the oars came into play. Here lay another secret to its efficiency. The rowers were the warriors themselves. Every crew member was a versatile individual. He rowed, he managed the sail, and he fought. This created an incredible cohesion among the crew. Like a modern hybrid car that uses electric power in the city and a gasoline engine on the highway, the longship chose the optimal mode of propulsion for any situation. Its bow and stern were practically identical. This simple feature allowed the ship to instantly change direction without turning around. Rowers simply switched sides and began rowing in the opposite direction. Imagine a modern ferry that doesn't need to turn around to leave the dock. For Vikings caught in a narrow, dead-end fjord or river, this capability was a matter of life and death. It was a small engineering detail that ensured the success of hundreds of raids. However, the longship also had its weaknesses. It's a classic example of a glass cannon. Enormous offensive power based on speed and surprise, but very weak defense. Low sides offered no protection from arrows, and the absence of a continuous deck left warriors completely exposed. In a direct boarding fight with a tall and heavy ship, it had little chance. Therefore, all Viking tactics were designed to avoid such confrontations. The longship was a weapon of asymmetric warfare, and its famous carved dragon heads on the bow were often removable. They were installed before a raid to intimidate enemies and removed upon returning home, so as not to anger good spirits. And this confrontation begins with the very wood itself. The Romans built their ships on the frame first principle. They created a powerful internal skeleton of frames and then planked it with boards joined edge to edge, using a complex mortise and tenon technology. This allowed for true industrial production, but resulted in a heavy and inflexible hull. The Vikings, on the other hand, built from the planks. They first created a light and strong shell by clinker building the boards with iron rivets, and only then inserted the ribs for rigidity. This is like the difference between building a skyscraper, where the steel frame is erected first, and building an igloo, where the shell itself is the load-bearing structure. The Roman method created a fortress. The Viking method created a living creature. Their engines were equally distinct. The Trireme's engine consisted of 170 rowers, a vast muscular mass for a short, furious burst. A peak speed of 7 to 8 knots was achieved for the mere minutes necessary for a ramming attack. This was pure power. The longship's primary engine was the wind. A huge sail, up to 100 square meters in area, allowed it to travel for weeks at 10 to 12 knots. Oars served as an auxiliary motor for maneuvers or entering rivers. Rome chose the brute force of man. The Vikings chose the force of nature itself. This ultimately determined their fate in the ocean. The Trireme, designed for the relatively calm Mediterranean, would have simply been crushed by a North Atlantic storm. The longship, however, was born for these waters. It was capable of transoceanic voyages. The best proof is Leif Erikson's journey to North America around the year 1000 CE, 500 years before Columbus. This would have been absolutely impossible on a trireme. Yes, the longship was a wet ship, its flexible hull constantly let in water, and the crew tirelessly bailed it out. But it didn't break. It flexed with the waves. Here we come to a key difference in philosophy. The trireme was a transport for a weapon. Its purpose was to deliver a ram and 100 legionaries to the enemy. The ship itself was merely a means. The longship, however, was the weapon itself. Its speed, its ability to appear out of nowhere and disappear into nowhere, that was its main striking force. If the trireme was a boxing glove for one crushing blow, the longship was a surgeon's scalpel, designed for a precise and sudden cut. And finally, navigation. The Romans practiced coastal navigation, moving from port to port along familiar coastlines. They oriented themselves by the sun and the contours of the land. This was like driving with a detailed road map. The Vikings, however, would not see land for weeks. They crossed the open ocean, navigating by the stars, the behavior of birds, and possibly using the legendary sunstone, a crystal that allowed them to determine the sun's position even on overcast days. Their navigational art was orders of magnitude superior. It was like crossing a desert, reading signs invisible to others. This disparity in seamanship reflected a chasm in their very philosophies of war. Rome's military doctrine was simple and ruthless. Find the enemy fleet, force a decisive battle, and destroy it. Triremes operated in large squadrons, using precise formations like legions on water. Their admirals were often generals with no naval experience because they transferred land army tactics to the sea. Their goal was a decisive battle, such as the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, where Octavian's fleet obliterated the fleet of Mark Antony and Cleopatra, deciding the fate of the empire. Rome sought complete and unconditional dominance. This was a strategy of order. The Vikings had a doctrine of guerrilla warfare. Their strength lay not in battles, but in mobility. They didn't want to control the sea. They wanted to use it. The ideal Viking raid was one where there was no fighting at all, and the plunder was rich. The Great Heathen Army, which invaded England in 865, used longships as mobile bases. They penetrated deep into the country via rivers, paralyzing any resistance. The longship allowed them to bypass any coastal defenses and disappear before the enemy could react. This was a strategy of chaos. A ship is a mirror of society. On a trireme, there was a strict hierarchy: commander, navigator, officers, marines, and rowers. A clear division of labor, just like in a Roman legion. In business terms, the trireme was a huge corporation. The longship, on the other hand, was a startup. Every crew member was both a warrior and a sailor. The commander, a konungur, or jarl, was merely first among equals. Everyone had a share in the company, meaning the loot, and all worked towards a common result. This flexible structure was ideally suited for small groups operating at their own risk. Let's imagine the impossible: a squadron of triremes encountering a fleet of longships in the open sea. The Vikings would stand no chance. The Romans would board them and overwhelm them with superior numbers of infantry. They could use ballistas, firing heavy bolts to damage the light longships even before they closed in. Due to their low sides, the Vikings would have to fight, literally, from below, while javelins and stones rained down on them from the trireme's deck. In a linear battle, the floating fortress wins. Now let's change the battlefield. A dozen longships raid a coastline patrolled by a lone trireme. Here, everything changes. The longships can hide in shallow coves, enter river mouths, and land troops where there is no port. The trireme simply cannot pursue them. The longship had another incredible advantage. It could be portaged overland between rivers. Vikings could appear where they physically could not be. The trireme would be like an elephant trying to catch a pack of wolves in a dense forest. Here, the sea serpent wins. So whose ship was more perfect? The answer is simple: both. Each was an absolute masterpiece for its specific task. It's like asking what's better, a hammer or a screwdriver. The trireme was the ideal hammer, designed to drive one huge nail to destroy the enemy fleet in a decisive battle and establish total control over the sea. The longship, however, was the ideal screwdriver, designed to carefully turn screws, to penetrate deep into enemy territory, extract valuables, and disappear. They were perfect answers to entirely different questions. But history delivers its verdict. With the fall of Rome, the very need for triremes vanished. Their complex technology, honed for the very specific conditions of the Mediterranean, proved to be an evolutionary dead end. The legacy of the longship proved far more enduring. Its clinker construction, flexibility, and versatility influenced all subsequent shipbuilding in Northern Europe, from medieval trading vessels to the ships of the Age of Discovery. The technological DNA of the longship survived and propagated. Ultimately, these two ships are the material embodiment of two different worldviews. The trireme symbolizes centralized power, order, and imperial confidence that the world can and should be conquered. It represents the spirit of the settled civilization builder, creating rules. The longship symbolizes adventure, the recognition that the world is chaotic and dangerous but full of opportunities for the brave. It represents the spirit of the pioneer, venturing into the unknown. But the main paradox is that the longship, a ship of chaos, ultimately became an instrument of civilization itself. It was on longships that Vikings settled Iceland and Greenland, creating new kingdoms in England and Normandy. These two ships show us that technology is always a mirror of the culture that created it.